The traditional relations and the current curiosity Hanoi has with Pyongyang is vividly reflected in this story. In 2017, Vietnam hosted the APEC Summit. Less than 2 years later, it manages to put itself back on the map by being the host country of the second Kim-Trump Summit. The visibility of Vietnam to the world is a result of the country's booming economy thanks to its own version of opening up policy. So what is the Vietnam style? Could it stand as a reference for the DPRK if the latter opens up in the future? In a one-on-one interview, the UN resident coordinator in Vietnam, Kamal Malhotra, helped me to analyze the Vietnam style. How do you look at the global supply chain and this region, Asia as a whole, has been the benefiter of the global supply chain changes over the past 2 to 3 decades. And China entered WTO, Southeast Asian countries also becoming very important players on that global supply chain. How do you see the recent debate about trade that has been evolving in the world having an impact here as well?
Well, I mean, this region has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of open trade. I think the big challenge going forward is that with the so-called Industry 4.0, the nature of trade is going to change, the nature of global value chains are going to change, and only those countries that are well positioned to take advantage of the new technologies will be able to provide value added. And I think that's the big challenge for a lot of Southeast Asia, which is not gone up the economic ladder as rapidly as some people thought in the past. And I think this is where Vietnam has a huge opportunity. It is aware of the big challenges of Industry 4.0. It's aware that at this point it's not really prepared, but it is putting very high priority on this.
If it is only Industry 4.0, it will be a simple matter to a certain extent. However, there are other factors coming into being, for example, ideology, geopolitics, as you may know very well, these days involved in the global debate, not just about trade, but almost everything. So how complicated and the balance that countries here, Vietnam, for example, needs to take in order to guarantee it will be a continuous process of prosperity, but on the other hand, not to be have to be forced to take its position to take to stand in teams, so-called, as we have witnessed in the Cold War.
Well, Vietnam is one of the most open economies in the world, and in this region, its trade to GDP ratio is 200%. So Vietnam has no option but to continue to pursue an open trade regime. Its big challenge is to increase its productivity and competitiveness. That is a big challenge. That's one of Vietnam's biggest challenges, because right now it has benefited in the last 25 years largely from a large amount of FDI, which has been 100% foreign owned, and relatively cheap labor. What it now needs to do is to go up the economic ladder. It needs to get more technology transfer through FDI. It needs to have much more value-added labor contributions. That means much more investment in science and technology policy, research and development. These are the big challenges. So I don't think for Vietnam it is going back. It is how does it go forward. The next big jump for Vietnam is going to be much more complex, much more difficult than the last 25 years, simply because when you start from a very low base, it's much easier to reach where Vietnam's reached. When you now want to go to upper middle income country status by 2035, as I've been saying to the government, the challenges are much more acute. But Vietnam, is genuinely comfortable with an open trade regime. And I think it just needs to get much more out of the FDI that it's getting in terms of the quality of the FDI.
Well, when you talk about the nature of the FDI, of course, it's a very sensitive topic, some say, as to whether you have strings related to it or linked to it. For example, technology transfer, that's also a debate going on right now in the world. So how do you see, on the one hand, developing country, emerging economy, it should enjoy their rights to update their industry, as you said, but at the same time be able to do it steadily while at the same time winning support?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is increasing the quality of your human capital and your
That's the key,
labor force. Yeah. So if you do that, a country like Vietnam, which is not a small country, it's a medium-sized country with a fairly large market, meaning it's got a population of 100 million people, roughly, can attract FDI not just as an input for export, but for its own domestic market. That's where Vietnam has to focus. It has to focus on increasing the quality of its labor force, its research and development, its graduates with science and technology backgrounds. Once that is done, given the other characteristics that Vietnam has, which are very favorable to FDI, and I don't mean tax incentives, I mean long-term political stability, a large-sized market, a disciplined workforce, then Vietnam will be clearly one of the beneficiaries. But it has to significantly increase the quality of its workforce in more sophisticated kinds of jobs.
How, though?
Well, part of it is just the quality of the education and training. But I think there have to be much greater incentives given to corporations to also invest much more in research and development, and also in the training of their workforces to increase their qualifications, their ability to deal with more complex operations, so that Vietnam is not left at the bottom end of the assembly operation.
Line. Yes, exactly. But if you look at the issue that China is facing right now, as a result of the elevation of industrialization and on the so-called global supply chain ladder, you see trade dispute possibilities with some of the biggest developed economies. So I guess that's also one thing that many developing countries and emerging economies have to think about, that when you grow up and bigger and more influential, how you are going to be reflected in the other's eyes, particularly developed economies, and how that relationship will be worked out in a way, hopefully equally. So any thought about that?
Well, I've done a lot of work on the World Trade Organization, and this is why you have a World Trade Organization. You have rules, multilateral rules. You have a dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO. All of these have to be adhered to by all parties. Otherwise, things break down. And so I think it's extremely important when we have these kinds of trade disputes that the WTO's legitimacy as the multilateral body tasked to deal with these issues with clear rules is the one that prevails. And I think that if that is accepted by everyone, as it should be, because they've all joined it, then I think we have a much better chance, rather than if you get into bilateral disputes or into regional free trade agreements where one side is normally much more powerful than the other side. Those are much more unequal. So I think the multilateral system, the trade system, is still, despite its limitations, and there are many, is still probably the best for the kind of situation that you're talking about, particularly involving medium-sized countries and small-sized countries.
Now, Vietnam is hosting the second Kim-Trump Summit, getting all of these attention, including us traveling all the way in order to get a glimpse of it and report about that. But the question is, how is Vietnam trying to evaluate its significance in this region and beyond? From your observation, what role does it aspire to play? Whether it's in economy, trade, geopolitics or its relations with its neighbors?
Well, I'll start by saying that Vietnam is strongly committed to multilateralism at both the regional level and at the global level. This is very clear, and this gives us as the UN a very important role to support Vietnam at both regional and global level. Vietnam's also now at a stage where it is confident that it can play and contribute to global peace and security. This is a wonderful story for a country that was at war only 40 years ago. And so Vietnam is increasing its contributions to global peacekeeping. This is a top area of priority for me as the UN resident coordinator. We've been working with them to strengthen their capacity to support global peacekeeping much more. The whole area of South-South cooperation, where the Vietnamese experience of poverty reduction, of economic growth, etc., can be shared particularly with many African countries, but also some other countries in this region. These are all things that Vietnam is now willing to put emphasis on and energy on because it wants to be seen as a good global citizen. It wants to be seen as a good regional citizen. And as you've seen outside, Hanoi is the city of peace, which UNESCO declared 20 years ago, is something they're very proud of. And I think with 2020 being a year where they will take over ASEAN as the chair, and they are running for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council for the 2020-21 year, what they're doing now in terms of hosting this, I think is totally consistent with all their aspirations to be a good regional citizen, a good international citizen, and to showcase what they've been able to do here to transform their country and society over the last 35 years.
The UN's role has also been evolving, not only globally, but also in different countries. For example, the DPRK nuclear issue, even though your job is not related to it, but it was the UN that has been playing a very instrumental role in making sure the mechanism is still there and different players are still making their efforts. How do you see an evolving UN holding on to some of the most difficult tasks that it has its responsibilities in, while at the same time be able to be flexible in a world that is now with dramatic changes? It sounds like a very loaded question, but I think that's a question you as a resident coordinator here in the UN in Vietnam or elsewhere in the world have to think about every day now.
Sure, we think about it every day. I'll start by saying that despite the UN's limitations, which I will stress are the limitations of its member states, not of the staff of the UN, okay? Because the UN can only be what its member states allow it to be. The UN is still the only global, legitimate, and impartial body, and in an era of fast accelerating globalization, you're going to need the UN more and more because, or a body like the UN more and more. If you reinvent the UN, it is far from clear that you will get something better than what you've got right now. And so we have to make sure that the current UN is strengthened by the member states to play the role that it can play as an impartial arbiter of many global disputes, of many of the kinds of challenges you're talking about, ranging from climate change to security challenges, to denuclearization. Only the UN has the legitimacy and, in fact, the tools to be, and the experience over the last 70 plus years to be able to do it. So we are going through a bit of a turbulent time in the world today, but I have no doubt that multilateralism will prevail simply because too many of the problems of the world cannot be solved, even for the most powerful countries, by any other means except multilateral. So yes, you're right that all of us as resident coordinators need to be thinking about it, and we are, but I do believe that it's for the member states to help us strengthen the UN. The current Secretary General has embarked on the most ambitious reforms of the UN development system, of the peace and security architecture. It's the first time that there is a full-time resident coordinator representing the Secretary General from January 1st in every country. And I think all of that is to strengthen our ability to support countries in addressing the challenges ahead, not just within the national boundary, but regional, interregional, and global.
And that is the UN Resident Coordinator in Vietnam. You're watching World Insight, our special program going to you on the eve of the second DPRK US Summit. I'm Tian Wei. The summit is to take place on the 27th and the 28th in Hanoi. What can we expect from it? Is it going to be just a show or a concrete step toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? I have been working my way in Hanoi and gathered these thoughts to help you make sense of the summit here.